So, we're going to talk a little bit about sociological perspectives on race and ethnicity. But before I get into that, I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about some basic sociological concepts. Some of you have probably covered these in the past if you've taken Intro to Sociology. Some of you may be familiar with some of the concepts from the chapter or perhaps from a social science class, but I just want to make sure that we have some basic concepts out there that everybody is comfortable with, and we can talk about a little bit in depth. So let's start just really basic. Let's start with what we mean by sociology. Sociology is a scholarly discipline that is concerned with the systematic study of social organization. There are some misunderstandings or some myths about sociology out there. I don't know how common these are anymore, but I know that over the past 20 some odd years, 30 some odd years of teaching, I've come across these before, so it's probably worth trying to dispose of them pretty quickly. First, sociology is not the study of individuals. Sociology gathers information from individuals often in its studies, but it isn't for the purposes of understanding individuals. We're interested in understanding the collective, the group, the aggregate. We're interested in determining what is true of a society, not necessarily what's true of all of the members of that society. And there's an important distinction there that I'll get to in just a moment. But suffice to say that sociology is not about trying to understand individual people. It's about trying to understand people collectively. Secondly, sociology isn't common sense. I remember when I first started in college, a lot of people in sociology classes would sort of come in with the attitude that sociology and maybe even other academic disciplines took what everybody really already understood about the world and just talked about it in very vague or opaque language, so as to sort of sound really important. But in fact, what sociology does is it takes the stuff that most people would sort of put into that category of common sense and problematizes it. We take things that most everybody else take for granted or accept without question, and we kind of unpack or analyze or try to understand those things a little bit more deeply. So the sociological perspective is characterized by three assumptions. And just as a side note, assumptions are things that we make when we're not able to establish something empirically. Right? So things that can't be demonstrated with evidence, but that are important to starting a particular argument or a particular line of reasoning, often have to be assumed because the argument or the line of inquiry kind of rests on those assumptions. In science, we try to minimize assumptions, but there are inevitably going to be some things that we have to assume. One not related specifically to sociology, but to science more broadly. One of these examples is something we call philosophical naturalism, right? It's the assumption that the universe that we inhabit is governed by a consistently operating set of principles. We assume that there are rules to the way that the physical universe works. There are rules to the way the social universe works, and that things will unfold according to those rules. So that's what I mean by assumptions. In sociology, the three major assumptions are that one, individuals are social by nature. What that means is that on a fundamental level, human beings are utterly dependent on. They would not exist independent of social organizations, of collections of people. This is actually relatively easy to see, if you apply a kind of inference, sort of a logical deduction. A newborn human infant left on its own will die. We don't have at birth the capacities for sustaining ourselves. We can't defend ourselves against predation. We don't recognize food. We don't know how to, take care of ourselves. If we were born and abandoned and left to our own devices, we would just simply die. And as a result, the species would die. So we are, again, by our nature, social beings, right? We rely on the existence of social structures in order to survive as organisms and, of course, as a species. So that's the first assumption of the sociological perspective, that human beings are, by their nature, social. Number two, human beings are, for the most part, socially determined. Now, socially determined just means that human behavior is explained to the greatest degree by social factors. Certainly, biological contributions are important. Environmental factors matter, but at the end of the day, the vast majority of what we see when we observe other human beings comes from human societies. It doesn't come from us organically. It isn't a function of environment. It's or at least solely a function of environment. It's how we collectively sort of respond to and teach others how to respond to the environment and to the physical realities of our being. So when we say that human beings are socially determined, that's what we mean. So take, for example, language, right? Language is a capacity that all humans are born with, right? All humans are born with the ability to acquire and utilize language. We are not born with language. We have to acquire that, right? So the tools that we use to make sense of and to describe the world around us come from the world around us. They come from our society. They don't come from us, even though we are having individual experiences of that world. We're using social resources to make sense of it and to share those experiences with others. The third assumption is that the social forms that surround us are created. The concept, or the term that we're going to use a lot, is that the world is socially constructed. That doesn't mean that there isn't a world outside of us. It just means that the understanding that we have of it, and consequently the impressions and the understandings that we share of that world with other people, are all mediated through social constructs, right? Language is, again, a very good example of a social construct, predicated on a system of symbols. So these are all things that we will get into to some degree or another over the course of the semester, but I wanted everyone to have a general sense of what these assumptions are. All right, so what we study then in sociology is summed up by a concept that comes to us from this guy, Emile Durkheim, French sociologist, late 19th, early 20th century. He identified the primary area of sociological inquiry to be what he called social facts, right? Things that are true of society that come to individuals from society, right, through that process of socialization. So when we when we're socialized into the society that we live in, we learn norms, for example. We learn language. We learn the patterns of behavior that are going to be expected of us. We internalize the values that define our society and shape those norms. And the pattern that gets created within the society as a result of that is a social fact. Durkheim very famously studied suicide in the late 1890s. Wrote a book called Suicide, in which he demonstrated that, among other things, people who were married were less likely to commit suicide than people who were single. People who were highly educated were more likely to commit suicide than people who were less educated. And Catholics were less likely to commit suicide than Protestants. So those things, right, the higher suicide rate for single people, for highly educated people, for Protestants, those things are social facts. It doesn't mean that every Protestant, every highly educated person, every single person is inevitably going to kill themselves, nor does it mean that Catholics who are married and uneducated won't. It just means that when you look at the groups of people, you see patterns, and those patterns are the social facts that sociology is interested in uncovering. Again, what is true of a society, not necessarily what is true of the individuals in that society. So that's sort of what we study. Now, our social facts for this semester are going to be built around issues of race and ethnicity and racial and ethnic inequality and things like that. So again, we're looking at patterns that are true at the level of society, not necessarily at the level of individuals in that society. It's going to be very, very important when we start talking about how you can have racism and racially discriminatory outcomes with even in the absence of individual people with racist intent. And again, that'll be later down the line, but keep that social facts thing in mind, because it again is going to recur a lot over the course of the semester. So social facts lead to the establishment of what we call social organization. Social organization is just the order of the society, right? It's it's evidenced by the positions of people within a structure. It's the roles and the norms that people play, the constraints that limit behavior, but that also allow us to sort of have some sense of predictability of what society is going to look like and how it's going to work at any given point in time. So social organization flows from the establishment of the same kind of things that create those patterns, that create those social facts. And the two primary sources of social or social organization are culture and social structure. We're going to mostly talk about social structure, but I do want to say a few things about culture before we jump into that. There are two ways to think about culture, and culture, again, it's all of the ideas, it's all of the things that are handed down from generation to generation in a group or a society. Two ways to think about culture. The first is that culture is a product of action. In other words, it's something we create. We do things, those patterns become defining of a society. Thus, we get its culture. Norms, values, symbols and language, beliefs, things like that. Those come from our actions. It is also the case that culture is what we call a conditioning element of future action, which is really just a fancy way of saying that culture guides our behavior. So if you're paying close attention, right, you'll see right away that these two ideas exist as a kind of paradox, right? That culture is a function of the things we do, but the things we do are shaped by culture. Again, that is definitely a paradox, but it is also the case that both of those things are true, right? And that's the nature of a paradox, two seemingly contradictory ideas that are both simultaneously true. The chicken and egg conundrum, right? Where do we get chickens? From eggs. But where do we get eggs? Well, they come from chickens. Wait a minute, right? And you go scratch your head a little bit. But both of those things are true. Eggs come from chickens, and of course, chickens come from eggs. So we don't have to resolve which came first. And maybe we can't, right? These things kind of co-evolve as we evolve as a species. They change a lot over time. Certainly the patterns of culture that exist are either encouraged or constrained by the material conditions that people live in, right? The kind of conditions in a society that exists, right? A society that is characterized by an abundance of resources is going to be a very different kind of society than one in which there are limited resources, right? And we mean that not just in terms of the quality of life, but the culture of that society as well. So you don't have to resolve the paradox, but it is obviously something that you have to be slightly comfortable with. So that's culture, and it'll come back from time to time. I think that culture is largely misunderstood by people, certainly outside of the social sciences. But even sometimes people within the social sciences. I know that for a lot of people, culture is kind of it's treated like as a kind of Swiss Army knife. something that can do anything. It's the go-to answer when you don't have a specialized tool. I know this because when I talk about my research, right, I study homeless people in multiple settings, right? Chicago, London, some East Asia, some Central and East Africa. Um, primarily Chicago and London, when I study homelessness and I present my results to people, sometimes in a talk, sometimes to students, sometimes just to people I run into, and we have a conversation about what I do. Um, I often ask people why they think there are differences in the behaviors of people who are homeless in Chicago, um, versus the behaviors of the people who are homeless in London. And very often somebody will say, well, it's because Chicago and London have different cultures, which is absolutely true. But the next question then is, of course, why do Chicago and London have different cultures? And people say, well, because they're different cultures. And you can see right there that they haven't really put that much thought into what that means to say that, a society has a particular culture. Um, so culture is something we want to understand. Culture is something we want to take into consideration. We don't want to oversimplify it. We don't want to be sort of cultural reductionists. Most of the differences that we're going to see, um, um, you know, across racial and ethnic groups in the United States, for example, aren't cultural so much as structural. But culture is going to play a role in both the arguments. Um, and efforts to explain the origins of these inequalities that we're going to spend some time on, but also some of the attempt to understand why they persist or their ultimate origin points, right? Their ultimate causes. So structure, which we'll spend a lot more time on, structure is essentially the patterns that get created um, and the relationships that get established among people and the various parts of social organization. So when students come into the classroom on Harper's campus every Wednesday at 9:30, and they sit in the seats, and the teacher comes in and stands at the front of the room, and then they engage in a particular set of behaviors, they are creating a structure called a college class. And they keep creating that structure until class is over, and then everybody goes away, and that class ceases to exist, right? And then it comes back together again the next time the teacher and the students come into the room together and begin to create that structure all over again. So when we engage in socially prescribed behaviors, we create a recurring pattern. That recurring pattern is a social structure. So race is a social structure. Racial inequality is a social structure. The institutions and organizations in which those relationships play out and the dynamics play out are social structures, right? So all of these things surround us all the time, but they're often really, really hard to see. They're really hard to see for a variety of perceptual and social psychological reasons. The main one is that when we look at other people, we see individuals, right? We don't see structures. We don't see people as representative of social expectations. We see them as individual human beings. And it's very easy for us to attribute their behaviors to some individual level cause, like, a sort of psychological explanation for their behavior. But in fact, when the teacher stands in front of the classroom and does the things that they do, or when the teacher and when the students sitting in their seats do the things they're not doing those things, um, because that stuff originates inside of them. They're putting into action a set of social expectations, and that's what social structure is. It's the social expectations that are kind of given form by the actions of the people who inhabit those various parts of society. Um, so again, I think that you want to always be mindful that these patterns are going to reflect a broader set of considerations and needs, right? We have the material conditions of the society around us. Um, there's a concept called historical materialism that says that in order to survive as a society, in order to survive as a species, we have to produce and reproduce all of the material requirements for life, and also the resources that shape that process. So again, we always want to consider social action embedded in its particular context. What that means is that all social behavior, or the meaning, I should say, of all social behavior resides in that particular moment in time and that geographical location, right? You can't decontextualize human behavior and have it make sense, right? All human behavior kind of lives in a moment in history, and it lives at a point in space. So geography and history are always going to be important parts of a sociological analysis, even though those are also separate disciplines. But one of the things you'll see over the course of the semester is the degree to which all of those things are really kind of carefully and inextricably interconnected. Um, so seeing this stuff, like I said, is really hard because we see people as individuals. We don't see people as representations of social expectation. It is possible to see that, but you have to learn how to look for it. You have to develop what C. Wright Mills calls a sociological imagination. And a sociological imagination is just that. It's the ability to see or to imagine that human behavior is a function of larger sort of processes and larger sorts of phenomena than those individual human beings. Um, when I first started teaching, when I was a TA in my first year in graduate school, I worked for a guy who taught a course in social psychology. I was his teaching assistant, and he used to start every semester by saying to his students that structure is hard to see because of its nature. And what he meant by the illustration that he used to kind of make that point was that he would say the last creature to be aware of the existence of water would be a fish, which seems kind of weird, right? Because fish are surrounded by water. How could they not notice it? But because they are surrounded by it, they don't notice it. The only time fish become aware of water is when they're taken out of water and they realize, oh, I need that to be able to survive. So one of the fun side exercises of sociology over the last 150 or so years that this has been a discipline, has been to try to find ways to make people aware of the thing that they normally just take for granted. So, when you read the piece by Peter Berger, he talks about culture shock and the way that culture shock allows us to sort of take a step back and recognize what kind of assumptions we had in a particular moment, or Max Weber, another early sociologist, would call a shocking discovery. Right, a shocking discovery is something that makes us question what we had previously taken for granted. So we're always looking for those kinds of experiences because they can take us kind of out of our comfort zone and put us into a situation where we see things in a way that we hadn't seen them before. That hinges to a great deal on the degree to which we're willing to embrace skepticism. Now, skepticism is something that is at the core of all scientific systems of inquiry. Skepticism is just doubt or unbelief with regard to things that are commonly accepted or taken for granted. We live in a society in the United States in the 21st century. We live in a society that puts a lot of emphasis on certainty, right? We want people to be sure of things. The problem is that being sure of things can create a little bit of a trap. When we're certain about things, we stop asking questions. When we're certain about things, we don't pursue lines of inquiry, or we find ways to dismiss contradictory pieces of evidence, right? If you've taken a class in psychology, you've probably come across something like confirmation bias, where people will pay attention to information that confirms a position they already hold, and they will dismiss or ignore information that seems to contradict that. There are a number of different cognitive operations that kind of get in the way of being able to be skeptical. One, like I said, is the confirmation bias. Another might be something like the Dunning-Kruger effect, where people overstate their abilities in particular areas of, like, say, for example, skills or talents, because they lack the ability to recognize that they're not as good as they think they are. It's a very, very academic and convoluted way to say that some people are too stupid to realize they don't know something. And that may seem mean or kind of cruel, but that is in essence what the Dunning-Kruger effect is. So there are these kind of cognitive biases, not to mention, as I said, the kind of cultural pressure put on us to be certain about things. But I would argue that the better position to hold, and one that is more consistent with, like I said, scientific inquiry in general, is skepticism. And it's a no-lose proposition. And I mean it in this way. If you are skeptical, you are going to question, at least on some level, you're going to question what you think you know, which means that you're going to gather information, you're going to be open to arguments, you're going to hear critiques of your standpoint or your take on things, and one of two things is going to happen. If you are right, it's going to be confirmed that you're correct. If you're wrong, you'll discover that you're wrong and then have the opportunity to move toward a more correct take or a more correct interpretation. So skepticism actually doesn't really result in any greater risk than just being willing to entertain the possibility that you might be wrong about something. Now, like I said, that's easy to say, but in a society where we've got a lot of pressure to be right and to be sure, and with a set of cognitive biases that kind of skew us perceptually toward downplaying or ignoring skepticism, it's not easy, but it's definitely something that you want to apply. And part of the way that you can do that is through cultivating a degree of ability with regard to critical reasoning. Now, critical reasoning, we hear about this all the time, right? That certainly higher education, but also in many respects, the K through 12 education system is about cultivating, among other things, critical thinkers. We want people to be critical thinkers, to apply critical reasoning. And there's a very good question that comes from a lot of people in response to that, which is, what do you mean by that, right? What is critical reasoning? I don't understand. Is it criticism? Is it critiquing something? It's not quite that. When we talk about critical reasoning, it's really an application of skepticism, right? We want to apply some scrutiny to the claims about the world around us, right? We don't want to just take something as presented. We want to ask a few questions of it before we accept it or before we begin to accept it. So when we talk about critical reasoning in the social sciences, we're talking about assessing the logical adequacy and the empirical adequacy of nonfiction statements. Let me just very quickly say why we limit this to nonfiction. Because we assume that the world that we live in, the physical world that we live in, is governed by rules. It's governed by consistently operating principles. In the world of fiction, there does not have to be any adherence to any preset, pre-existing set of rules. There can be. You can have a fictional universe that operates consistently within its own sort of self-contained universe, but you can also have hobbits and wizards and dragons and alien species, right? And so the world that we live in, the nonfiction world, is governed by rules or principles. The world of fiction doesn't have to be. So when we talk about critical reasoning, we're going to apply it just to the nonfiction world, claims about the world that we actually live in. Um, the two parts of critical reasoning are assessing, like I said, logical adequacy and empirical adequacy. Logical adequacy refers to the degree to which conclusions follow logically from the premises. Um, does does the conclusion reflect a kind of logical operation, and does the claim make sense? In other words, it's a practical consideration. It's not sort of highfalutin or abstract. It's does this claim make sense? The second part, of course, empirical adequacy refers to whether or not the claim is supported by data. Right? Do we have data that suggests that this is true? So you need both. Um, the risk um, of abandoning one or the other is that you can have something that is supported by data but is not logical. Or you can have something that is logical but doesn't have any evidence to support it, right? And so we would be in either of those two situations able to sort of dismiss a claim because we don't have support for it. We need both elements to be sort of fully critiqued, right? Fully analyzed and understood. So, for example, this is a really silly example, but it's also one I think that illustrates the point. Um, Since the 1700s, the number of pirates in the world has been declining. Also, since the 1700s, average global temperature has been going up. Those two things are empirically true. We have fewer pirates in the world, on the oceans, right? Pirates, right? We have fewer pirates in the world in 2022 than we did in 1740. It is also a warmer planet in 2022 than it was in 1740. So if I were to assert that the rise in temperature is explained by the decline in pirates, all of you, I would hope, all of you would say that's nonsense, right? And you'd be right. There's no way that conclusion follows from the premise, right? Why would a decline in pirates make the planet warmer, right? There's nothing there that makes that logical. So you can have a claim that is empirically supported, but that is completely illogical, right? That's why we need both of those things together. We need to understand when we are looking at a claim about the world, we want to critique it on both its logic and on the degree to which it's supported by the data. All right, almost done. A couple more points I want to make, and then we'll wrap this up. So when we assume philosophical naturalism and we engage in our practical application of skepticism that we call critical reasoning, we are able to sort of begin to conduct an analysis of the world around us. Right? We can analyze the nature of race and ethnicity. We can look at the reality of racial and ethnic inequality. We can consider history. We can look at the operations that led us to where we are at the current moment and the material conditions that shape that. We can also even project a little bit into the future, right? Based on what we understand about the present and the past, we can talk a little bit about the future. So it's important then that we get three essential conditions right if we're going to do this. If we're going to do this kind of analytical breakdown of a particular aspect of society. And for us, it's going to be race and ethnicity, but it could be sex and gender. It could be class inequality. It could be the operation of healthcare systems. It could be the nature of the family, right? There are all kinds of different things about society that we want to understand. Doesn't matter. You have to do three things. You have to address three essential conditions. First, you need to get your facts right. Right? The basic facts of the nature of the world and the nature of the conditions around us have to be gotten right, and that's a function of description. Now, description is really important. It's also, I think, one of the easiest to get right. Doesn't mean we always do, but description without anything else is essentially journalism. right? So we go out and we document the things that are happening in the world around us, and those understandings become the starting point for the other two things that we're going to do, which is explain and evaluate. So once we've gotten the basic facts right, we can begin to try to understand how things really work. In other words, we can explain things. And of course, to do that, we need sociological thinking. Um, right? We need the ability to see how the operation of structure and how the operation of culture, social organization overall, is creating the kind of society that we live in. Right? Here is how this has come to be, and I want to be clear about something. And I'll get sloppy over the course of the semester, and I'll sometimes say why. But in sociology, we always try to ask how questions, because why questions are ultimately about motivation. How questions are about process, right? How do things come to be? Um, why things come to be can't really be answered, because why, again, needs to be able to get at a person's underlying intent. If you're trying to understand things at an individual level, and we can't because we're not privy to other people's minds, we can't know why they do the things they do. We can know what they do, and we can know the consequences of what they do, but we can't really ever know why. At the level of society, society doesn't have intention, right? So to try to ask a why question of society is also kind of nonsensical, but for different reasons. So the questions are always going to be process questions. Explanation questions are always process questions. So description is important, explanation is important, and of course, evaluation, right? So evaluation requires us to take a stand on how society needs to change. Um, this is something that I think science, both social and physical sciences, were really, really squishy about back in the 20th century, right? They tried to be objective. They tried to say, we're going to avoid commenting or taking a stance or a position, because if we take a stance or a position, people could accuse us of not being objective, of somehow being biased. I got news for you. Everybody is biased. There is no such thing as objectivity, right? Because judgment always intrudes. People can't be value free. You can't do value free research. I mean, think about it. Even the choice to study A rather than B is going to bias what you find, right? Because A is going to show you some things, B will show you other things, and you've decided that it is more important to look at A than it is to look at B. You've already introduced judgment. You've already introduced a bias that's going to skew, right, whatever it is you find. So rather than pretend like we're objective, we try to just generally account for the way in which our biases might be shaping our conclusions. But it is the case, especially I think in the social sciences, and maybe especially for sociology, if we understand how the social world has come to be the way it is, and we understand that that social world works well for some people but not for others, it's kind of incumbent on us to provide insight and suggestions and guidance in how to address that, right? So taking a stand and saying that society needs to be better at A, B, or C is the natural and inevitable conclusion of a process that begins by describing the things that we see and explaining how we got there, right? And unless there works for everybody, unless there is a just and equitable society, I think it's not unreasonable to say that maybe the next step after that is to say, here's how we can make it better. So that's why description, explanation, and evaluation are all important in doing these kinds of analyses. All right. So the last thing I want to say is just some stage setting for where we're going to go next. And I want to just basically set the stage for the current conditions with regard to race and ethnicity and how they operate in the United States. We're going to go into a lot of detail over the course of this semester, but I want you guys to understand two broad things sort of from the beginning, so that when we dive in, none of this stuff is surprising. So the first thing to keep in mind about race and ethnicity and the way it operates in the United States in the 21st century is that conflict, discrimination, and inequality between racial and ethnic groups in this country remain deeply entrenched. We still have deeply seated racial problems in the United States. I know that a lot of people try to pretend like that's not the case. I'm not quite sure what society they're looking at, um, but um, but there it is, right? There are still deep problems. This is true in spite of declines in open discrimination. It's true in spite of the passage of civil rights laws. It's true in spite of improving conditions for some racial and ethnic groups in this country. People will say, well, it's better than it was, which is true in many regards, not as better as some people might like to think. But it is true that some things are better today than they were 40 or 50 years ago. That doesn't mean they're where they need to be, right? If we're moving in the right direction, that's a good sign, but moving in the right direction and being at your destination are not the same thing. The election of Barack Obama, the fabulous wealth of somebody like Oprah Winfrey, does not negate the reality that for a lot of blacks, for example, in the United States, political power and the ability to have a really strong say in the operation of their and the reality and the nature of their communities remains elusive. The fabulous wealth of Oprah Winfrey or other black entertainers or entrepreneurs doesn't negate the fact that blacks have higher than average representation among the poor, and right on and on and on. So keep that in mind, right? That while things are not as bad as they were, they're not as good as they could be, right? That's really, really important to acknowledge. Number two, intergroup relations, and that just means the relations between racial and ethnic groups. Anytime you see a word that begins with INTER, that means between, right? INTRA means within, but INTER always means between. So intergroup relations in the United States are becoming increasingly complex, involving a wider variety of dynamics and many, many more groups. And this will also be a recurring theme when we start to look at, say, for example, immigration and its relationship to race and ethnicity and how those things operate in the United States. But let me give you just one quick example of one of these dynamics that is happening and is creating some pressure points within society and some genuine pushback from some people. Latinos as a group have grown dramatically in the United States, the proportion of the population plus and the total numbers. Other racial and ethnic groups are seeing similar increases, though not as dramatic. But the point is that within the next, 2022, right? So sometime probably within the next 10 to 15 years, the United States is going to become what we call a majority minority country, which means that the majority of the population will be made up of members of minority groups. And we'll talk about the language we use to talk about majority and minority because it's a problem because we think of numbers, but it's also sometimes a reference to power or privilege or standing. But the United States right now, the over 50% of the population of the United States is white, non-Hispanic white. That is not going to be the case for very much longer, right? So we are going to become a majority minority state by mid-century. And that's going to have some interesting dynamics. It doesn't necessarily mean that power is going to shift, right? At the height of apartheid in South Africa, there were 25 million blacks and only 5 million whites, but whites were absolutely the powerful group in that society. So we want to keep that in mind, that just because there are numbers doesn't necessarily mean there's a corresponding shift in power. But as numbers shift, what the dominant group does to maintain its power has to become predicated on or built on something other than just having sheer numbers. So we've got a very interesting kind of dynamic that's unfolding in this country around issues of immigration, around issues of birth rate, within racial groups or within ethnic groups, the importance or the relative lack of importance of racial or ethnic identity, all of that stuff is always kind of in play. And that's only become increasingly the case over the last 40 or 50 years. So those are two things that I want you guys to keep in mind as we kind of get into the meat of this course, is that we still have deeply entrenched problems around race and ethnicity in the United States. And I suspect that most of you have some sense of that. And also, of course, that what we are going to be talking about is very, very complicated. We haven't even talked about the way in which racial and ethnic identities, which themselves kind of reflect hierarchies of inequality, intersect with other hierarchies of inequality like social class or sexuality or gender and sex, right? So all of this stuff is going to get a little bit complicated. I will do my absolute best, of course, to make sure it's as clear as possible to you guys. But as always, right, if you have any questions, if anything doesn't really make sense, or you feel like you just need a little bit more clarity, by all means, raise your hand virtually or in a literal sense and ask a question. That's the easiest way to get information, is to ask for it. All right, so that will take care of us for now, and I will catch you guys next time.